Hi everyone, and welcome to another part of these Solidity tutorials. In this part we're going to focus on a simple kind of escrow contract. So first of all, let's see what escrow is. The escrow refers to a kind of a financial arrangement where two parties, the seller and the buyer, are going to be trusted by somebody else who is a third party, and we call that third party an agent or a kind of an arbiter. So an arbiter is a judge who is going to make trust between the two parties, for example, the buyer and seller of a house or a car. As you see, most of the time when you want to buy a house or buy a car, you want to make sure that that specific person who you're going to buy that specific item holds that specific service or product or whatever it is that you're going to buy, whether it's a house or a car. And if you are someone from a remote country or a remote location, this kind of trust is very important. So here you choose an arbiter, and we've got a smart contract here that we want to create this kind of trust between the buyer and the seller, so that this third party is going to make sure that the buyer has enough money and the seller has that kind of product. So here the third party will get the money from the buyer and also make sure that the seller has the terms of conditions met, and then afterward it will send the money to the seller. So here we're going to write that kind of smart contract. To do so, let's create a file in the contracts folder. So new file, escrow.sol. Just as always, we will copy and paste the first two lines for the license and the version of Solidity. And now let's create a contract escrow, open the brackets, and here at first we need to define the addresses of the buyer, seller, and the arbiter. So address public buyer, address public seller, and address public arbiter. There we go. And also we need to define a boolean variable which is public, and it should be related to the released funds status, and we'll explain what it is. Okay, and then define the constructor for the buyer, seller, and the arbiter. So constructor, and then it will get the address of the seller and also the address of the arbiter, because these two are the ones who are authorized to at first that we want to deploy the contract. They are entered inside of the deployment field. So now the buyer is the message sender, is the one who runs the contract or deploys it, message.sender, and then the buyer should enter the addresses of the seller and also the address of the arbiter. There we go. And now here, instead of our function, we should actually create a function, and we need to call it releaseAmount. So releaseAmount, parentheses, and then public. And now open the brackets. So here it will require, at first there is this requirement for our release amount. And so the message sender should be buyer or the arbiter for release amount. So for releasing the amount of money, the person who should do it is either the buyer or the arbiter. The seller can't do it because the seller is not going to release the fund, right? So msg.sender equals to buyer, or msg.sender equals to arbiter. And otherwise, if the conditions do not hold, not authorized should be shown to the user. Okay, and once the condition holds, release funds equals to true. So we've got another function for refund amount. This is for the seller. The seller, for example, there are some conditions met by the seller, and a refund amount will be activated. So refund amount, and then public kind of function like the previous one. And here we need another requirement just like the one we had this time. This is for the message sender should be either the seller or the arbiter. Here the buyer cannot refund amount because the buyer is not going to offer some kind of product or service. So msg.sender equals to the seller, or msg.sender should be the arbiter, and otherwise will show the user not authorized. Okay, right, and so once that happens, release funds will be equal to false. So now let's save our contract. As you can see, it's been compiled successfully, meaning that everything has been done written correctly. Now it's time to test our contract. So let's click here, and right over here, inside of the fields of the deployment, we need to enter two addresses, one for the seller, the other one for the arbiter. So here we can choose from these addresses. I will choose the second one, copy it, paste it right over here for the seller, and also the third one, copy it and paste it for the arbiter. So now let's check it to make sure. Okay, they're different from each other. Make sure they're different. And now let's change the address to the first one, which is different from these other two addresses. And now we can click on the transact to deploy the contract. So now let's open the instance of the contract. And now here we should, as the seller, we should refund the amount. So here, because we're the buyer, if I click on this, as you can see, not authorized, it is not authorized. But let's go up here and click here on the buyer. I think this starts with 0xa. Oh, actually this is the seller, so that's right. So let's refund the contract. As you can see, it's been succeeded. Now as the buyer, if I click on release amount, as a seller, if I click on release amount, again, we're not authorized, so I can choose either the buyer or the arbiter. So for example, here I can choose the arbiter, which starts with 04b, or the one that is related to the buyer, which not sure, but I think it's 0xa. No, this is the seller. So the arbiter is 0x4, and so 0x5 is, I think, the buyer. So let's release the amount. As you can see, it's been done successfully. And by the way, if you want to know the addresses, you don't need to check here or here. You can just get the addresses from here, the arbiter, the buyer, and the seller. So you can simply copy and paste it right over here, so that you can you'll be authorized. So here, if I click on the release funds, you will see that it is true. But once I refund the amount again, here let's do it with the arbiter address. So arbiter and the seller can refund the amount. So let's here this time do it with the arbiter. It starts with 4B. So here let's choose the 4B and refund the amount. As you can see, it's been done successfully. Let's check the release fund. As you can see, it's false. Why? Because another time the seller has refunded the amount, meaning that another product or service has been offered by the seller and the buyer should refund it in order to get it. So I can, because here this is the address of the arbiter, I can release the amount also by the arbiter address. As you can see, it's been successful. But if I do it with the address of the seller, it's not successful, right? That's why we set these kinds of requirements in these functions and then set the release funds status that way. So that's it for this part of our tutorial. We've learned how to create a very simple kind of escrow contract, and notice that an escrow contract could be much more complex and have even more conditions to be met. So that's it for this part of the tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed it, and until the next one, goodbye.